what ends up happening is exactly what Poe predicted. Massive casualties and the Resistance getting blasted to oblivion.
Yeah, because of Poe's plan. You know what? Never mind.
And even when that starts happening, Holdo is just staring at their destruction like she's dumbfounded. Instead of immediately taking action while the Order is firing on them, both before and after Kylo kills Snoke, she just watches on. She literally just sits there for minutes on end looking at them getting blown up before finally going, hey, I should probably do something.
Maybe because she didn't know what to do? But I'm sure you'll call her solution stupid too.
In case you haven't figured it out by now, Holdo is a fucking idiot who has no business being an admiral, and yet we're supposed to view her as a heroic and noble character who's willing to sacrifice herself so that the others can escape. And now all of her poor decision making is supposed to make sense because Leia told Poe about the plan well after it was too late. No. Just no. Aside from being a toxic mouthpiece for Kathleen Kennedy's female-driven politics, which I'm gonna get into later, she's simply a garbage leader. She acts like an immature child instead of an experienced commander, being disrespectful to her subordinates for just asking a reasonable question.
You know what? I'm just gonna skip until you actually say something I haven't debunked like 12 times over. Enjoy my high-quality skip screen, bitch!
Why did Leia even have to be removed for the sake of shoving in Holdo? Why did they kill off Admiral Akbar so carelessly just to introduce her? When you really think about it, Holdo is a completely pointless addition to the movie because she's a useless character who does nothing to contribute to the franchise. It might have been one thing if she actually did something to have an effect on the story, but she just spends her screen time standing around doing nothing. If you cut Holdo out and just put Admiral Akbar or Leia in her place, the story would play out exactly as it did before.
See, the way you describe her doing nothing can apply to anyone. If her actions were done by Akbar or Leia, you're right, it wouldn't change the movie. Same goes for if what Rose did was just done by Finn, or if what Finn did was done by Poe, or fuck, if Yoda was Rey's mentor instead of Luke. Saying a character can be replaced by another character is meaningless because of course they fucking can. That applies to anyone, Dunger. I also like how you said that she did nothing and then said the story would be the same if what she did was done by someone else. So, you know, indicating her actions were actually important when you just said that she did nothing. Absolute Dunger, 0 out of 10.
The inclusion of Holdo changes nothing. Actually, scratch that. It does change one thing. Our understanding of lightspeed travel that completely destroys and derails the entire lore by abruptly weaponizing it 8 movies into the franchise, with no explanation and no regard for how many plot holes it would open in the previous films, in spite of people shrugging it off by saying, oh, it's a really stunning visual that shows how amazing the special effects in this new trilogy are. No. It looks cool is not an excuse for retconning the lore like this. You cannot introduce something like this far into the franchise. It's the equivalent of introducing Kai Leng in Mass Effect 3. Not only does it make no sense here, but it makes no sense that the Elusive Man would never think to use him at any point in the previous 2 games. Why did no one else in Star Wars ever think about doing this before?
Okay, so the comparison to Mai Ling doesn't really work, and that's without me knowing Mass Effect to know who the fuck Mai Ling is, or if I'm even spelling his name right in my fucking script. The reason nobody did this before is because it's literally suicide. Duh. Ya bitch. In addition, you ever think that this is a reason why she delayed the act? Because she was about to do something that had never been done before? Typically, and I'm not sure if you know this, suicide tactics are not something that people do frequently. It's even weird that this one happened twice in the same war, actually. If I had a nickel for every time someone committed suicide with a ship in order to drive it through another person's ship in Star Wars, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. Oh, and nerd time, by the way. Weaponizing a ship's hyperdrive has been explored in Star Wars before, although where it comes from is technically no longer canon. Clone Wars Season 1, Episode 4, the navigation of a ship was rigged to hyperjump them into a moon. Not quite the same as the Holdo maneuver, but probably a more likely application than sending yourself through another ship, which in fact is confirmed to be impossible since the whole reason it works is because the collision happens directly before entering hyperspace. Oh, and this tactic would be especially rare since, well, rarely would that cost-benefit analysis work out except in an outright desperate situation.
Why didn't they use it against the Death Star to prevent Alderaan from being destroyed?
Because the Death Star was so much larger that it probably wouldn't have done much without outright knowing where its weak spot was. and you would be ordering someone to commit suicide, if not an entire crew. And we've also only seen the Holdo maneuver used at close range, indicating that it's not reliable enough to be fired at long distances, or possible at all to be fired at long distances. Fuck. I mean, I just needed the literal suicide reason. This is like listing off reasons to not have sex with your mother.
And if someone tries to use the novel version to explain this away with something like, oh, the damage was caused by the experimental shields on the Radis, that's not an excuse. This is basically saying that this plot-crucial information was something that should have been put in the movie and they were too lazy to take the time to include it. It's a cheap method for trying to fix a plot hole months after the film was released.
Okay, so for one, that explanation is not 100% accurate, since I doubt the freighter from Rise of Skywalker also had an experimental shield system on it, and it worked then as well. It was also explained in that movie as being unlikely to work then, so yet another reason why nobody tried it before, even if the experimental shields weren't the reason it worked. You really think that an entire ship and your life is going to be worth a 1 in a million shot unless it is exactly as desperate as when Holdo used it? Come on, dude.
I think the Fourth Snake put it best in his video about Devora and MK10. Refusing to explain plot-crucial detail to the audience, unless they're willing to purchase additional supplementary material, is terrible storytelling.
This really isn't that crucial. Explains why it works in finite detail, which isn't necessary for a momentary improvised tactic.
And if anything, this just makes it even worse. They know they broke the universe with this stupid idea, so they just made up the excuse that some ships are special. I mean, experimental shields? Really? What do they do? Just make the ship susceptible to hyperspace ramming? That's a pretty big leap in shield technology they never bothered to explain.
Hyperspace ramming was already something ships were susceptible to. In reality, the experimental shield thing, the way they explain it, could apply to regular shields. But basically, the shield continues to move even the ship is destroyed. And again, it requires specific distance between ships as well, since the ship has to be destroyed while in transition into hyperspace. See, that's the thing. I don't like the explanation from the novelization either, but the reason I don't like it is because it's completely unnecessary, because hyperspace ramming would theoretically already be possible, and it makes sense that it wouldn't be a standard tactic, because in any other situation, it would be incredibly stupid. And you could even have used this tactic as an actual good reason to call Holdo stupid, but instead you focus on bitching about world building making sense when it fucking does make sense.
And it also adds salt in the wound that these new films are just doing whatever they want with lightspeed travel regardless of how much sense it makes. Hyperspace out of a hangar? That's cool. Hyperspace into the gravity well of a planet? It's cool. Hyperspace as a weapon? Let's do it.
Yeah. All of these are being depicted as things that are highly dangerous as well when they come up, and well, in the real world, we discover new ways to do things that should be impossible all the fucking time. Do you not understand what technology is? Tell somebody in the 80s that it would be possible to have a computer with access to the internet that can make phone calls in their pocket instead of a giant brick of a phone in their car, and not only will they call you crazy, but also ask what the fuck the internet is, because that's part of the point I'm making with this interjection. Technology and methodology can and does evolve in an instant.
They're not taking any sort of internal consistency into account. It doesn't matter what excuse you come up with. This writing decision completely nullifies every single previous movie by ruining the spaceship battles.
Yes, because suicidal tactics are always the first thing you think of somebody doing in order to win. Are you dense?
You might remember in my original review that I used midichlorians as an example for disrupting the consistency in Star Wars, pointing out how they have the same problem as the Holdo maneuver. But you know what? I don't think that was a fair comparison, because I can at least see the possibility of some kind of explanation to justify the midichlorians, like limiting the power level of the characters so everyone isn't just freely demolishing everything like Anakin. This is completely indefensible because it brings absolutely everything into question. Why hasn't anyone done this before?
Skipping until you say something I haven't already debunked. Fuck this.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, that was faster than I thought it'd be. Alright.
Why hasn't anyone made vulture droids for the purpose of hyperspace ramming? Droids that have no thinking or consciousness. They just abruptly introduced the most cost-effective way to blow shit up, and could simply just have droids do it instead of human pilots.
See, now that's a fair point. So now I get to address the why did nobody else think of this argument, because they didn't think of it. New methods of using existing technology is also something that happens in the real world pretty frequently, so that in and of itself isn't as much of a plot hole as you might think it is. but I suppose the vulture droid argument can be met with another argument. Why do we still have fighter pilots that aren't droids if you think close-range combat could just be handled by droids anyway? Your means of negating the cost of this tactic also applies to negating the cost of less risky tactics wholesale, which doesn't really put this tactic at an advantage over others. So, you know, that's why. Because we'd already be doing lower risk tactics the same way if we could reliably pull that off in the first place.
This one scene that was made for the sake of a cool visual has now raised far too many questions with no answers being provided to them. And when you look more into it, this concept of weaponizing hyperspace doesn't even know how hyperspace works. Hyperspace and normal space are not the same thing. Hyperspace isn't simply going very, very fast. It's entering another dimension where space-time makes travel distance shorter. Holdo's ramming plan should not work because you're supposed to be immaterial when going through hyperspace. But now that it's not immaterial, it completely destroys the concept of hyperspace travel. If you hit even a single speck of dust, your ship is going to explode.
Dude, even the book's explanation gives that the ship was destroyed before entering hyperspace. The reason entering hyperspace in a planet's atmosphere is nigh impossible is explained as the same concept. The concept of not wanting something directly in front of you when you enter hyperspace is already fucking there. How does this break that at all?
It's only by sheer luck that no one has blown up in the middle of a lightspeed travel by this point.
Except it's not, because this happened specifically during transition into hyperspace travel. Are you dumb? Answer yes.
Every time they jump to lightspeed, they are now at the risk of crashing into a gas cloud, planet, asteroid, sun, or another ship on their way to their destination. What kind of science fiction film doesn't even know how hyperspace works?
You ever notice how people don't enter hyperspace with shit in front of them? Except this one time? You have to know this is dumb, right? You have to. There's a transition. That's why you have to have space in front of you to go into hyperspace. Like, take what you just said about not knowing how hyperspace works. Write it on a piece of paper. Show it to yourself in the mirror. Ask yourself how the fuck you don't understand the concept of acceleration rates. Wad up the paper into a nice tight little ball, turn that sumbitch sideways, and activate its hyperdrive up your black hole, you cosmic nerve-hurting chuckle fuck!
But you know what? Let's put aside all that techno-babble for a moment. Let's just pretend that there was some sort of actual reason why no one thought of weaponizing hyperspace before, or that it's completely safe to use for travel.
So we're going to pretend the truth is the truth? Oh, okay, I can do that.
Star Wars completely because of one solitary fact. Introducing hyperspace as a weapon is a completely self-defeating concept. How are we supposed to respect any kind of laser weaponry now? They just created a world where the only real firepower is hyperspace missiles. Now fleets can just attack each other from miles away without even seeing each other.
This technique has only been done at close range. Fuck you with a stick made of sand.
Battles can suddenly end in minutes. Big battleships are now just giant bullseyes asking to be blown up. I mean, try to consider this. Why do you think we never saw LST as a weapon in any sci-fi story before now? Whether it's a movie, TV show, book, or video game. That's because not weaponizing LST is an unspoken rule of sci-fi.
Actually, you're full of shit. I mean, thanks to Scarlet Otaku's brother Steven for reminding me of some of these, but there's a whole list of bombs that utilize their setting's equivalent of hyperspace. You've got the slip space bomb from Halo Reach, literal subspace ramming in the same series, the vortex bomb from Warhammer 40k, shock attack guns, half the Dark Eldar arsenal. Oh, but this last one, somehow this is an even bigger fuck up on your part. See, there's the Galaxy Gun from the Legends canon of Star Wars. Yes, this was already in Star Wars. The Galaxy Gun actually fires lightspeed torpedoes, which are an ammunition capable of traveling through hyperspace, and first appeared in Dark Empire 2, which take place in the year 10 ABY, or after the Battle of Yavin. The Force Awakens, which takes place directly before this movie, mind you, takes place in 34 ABY. In other words, using lightspeed as a weapon, even with Legends no longer canon, still theoretically within the realm of possibility with consideration towards the amount of technological advancement there's been. But that's not the point. Point is that not only has it been done in sci-fi, it's been done in Star Wars specifically.
From a writing perspective, the second you introduce hyperspace ramming, you introduce a completely OP weapon that can't be countered. Something that has infinite destructive potential that solves all possible combat scenarios. And now that you've introduced it, everyone is gonna start threatening to use it, and now you destroyed the concept of spaceships fighting each other. It's the sci-fi equivalent of a nuclear warhead. Every military is now building these things and pointing them at each other's planets, making it completely impossible to write any plausible conventional fleet battle.
Except conventional warfare still happens in the real world because of people not wanting to resort to nukes and shit. Like, the fact that your real world example doesn't stop conventional combat in the real world shoots your entire argument in the foot. With a hyperspace torpedo. Thanks, Palpatine.
The reason why no one ever came up with hyperspeed as a weapon before is because it's a completely stupid idea. Other sci-fi stories considered the world-building ramifications of this idea and realized it would unbalance everything. They kept things consistent to maintain some sort of believability to the world they created.
Star Trek is hard sci-fi and Star Wars is a space opera. I was going to save it for my final thoughts, but at this point my final thoughts may as well just be me screaming into the ether for 12 minutes straight, so fuck it. Yeah, part of the problem here is that you're overthinking a lot of things. Star Wars is not hard sci-fi, which means it doesn't tend to use proper scientific explanations for shit as much. While some things remain grounded, other things dip more so into fantasy. Something that you don't really understand fully. Meanwhile, Star Trek takes much more of a hard scientific route. It's part of the reason for the initial divide of sci-fi fans between Star Wars and Star Trek. Trek is more science, Wars is more fiction. Star Wars isn't meant to be thought of in the same way that Star Trek is, because they are actually different fucking genres, and the fact that you need this explained to you proves that you don't understand either one of them!
The only reason I can think of for why this was allowed to happen is because Rian Johnson is a fucking idiot who doesn't know anything about sci-fi, and that stupid bimbo was too fucking lazy to proofread his storytelling before sending it off.
It's funny because he also wrote Looper. I mean, Looper has flaws, sure, but it's a lot more in the realm of hard sci-fi in terms of scientific implications than Star Wars is. Hell, you look at most of his work, he tends to be well known more so for intellectual thought pieces than action-based sci-fi, so if you have a problem with the way this scene is written, that's probably your damage right there. But I know we'll get into more about them, especially Kathleen Kennedy, considering how much you already had to say about her later, I'm sure. Also, considering Rian Johnson is also the director, who the fuck is Kathleen Kennedy sending this script off to? The producer? So, herself? That statement doesn't make any goddamn sense on a fundamental level either. Good job.
And it would have been bad enough if the hyperspace thing was the only world-shattering inconsistency in this movie. But unfortunately, it's only one of many, many blunders, making the world building completely sloppy and careless.
Okay. So, I know you guys can't see this, but this is where a new section of the video entitled Internal Consistency begins, which is, real ironic, let me tell you. You know, mainly because of the fact that this section even exists outright kicks the video's internal consistency in the groin. See, even just looking at the chapters of the video, we go from this to a really short section entitled Mauler that's probably really stupid, to talking about Kylo Ren. So we move off of characters, back into theme-based chapters, only to jump back into characters, when you outright said we're talking about characters first. I know this is close to 40 minutes into your video, and you won't believe how not done with you I am at this point, but if you're going to state what you're talking about, don't just assume that your audience is going to forget later. At best, they did, and they get mild whiplash at you changing your organizational structure on the fly. At worst, they become like me and want to call you out on the fact that you interrupted characters with the most ironic topic switch to focus on. I'd be impressed if I thought you did this on purpose.
For example, the bomb running scene. It makes no goddamn sense that the Republic or the Resistance abandoned Y-Wings in favor of these completely useless contraptions. I don't care how much explosive power those things have. They are objectively inferior. Their armor and shields are garbage. They travel extremely slowly. It's incredibly easy for an enemy ship to blow them up before they get within a mile of their target. They can easily end up team killing the ships assigned to protect them because the range of the debris from their death is way too massive. Their hull integrity is so horrible that they can easily be set off by by the tiniest debris coming in contact with them. They're completely counterproductive in these types of combat scenarios. They're made of paper, they're incredibly easy to hit given how slow they are, and the extremely high odds of friendly fire when they're destroyed are too much of a risk to just keep using. The only reason why that dreadnought was destroyed was because the TIE fighters were somehow too incompetent to get that one bomber they missed.
Okay, if you're gonna launch this complaint, don't launch it here, because B-Wings were a direct predecessor to this style of bomber used during the Battle of fucking Endor. The real one, not the garbage TV movies. Okay, so for one, let's assume that age isn't a factor, even though it totally is, since the X-Wing was first used 21 years after the introduction of the Y-Wing. So even newer models coming out over time, the general usefulness of a starfighter class would decline before the X-Wing would. And there actually was an old Y-Wing technically in service in the Resistance fleet, but let's be honest, barely. So let's look at the tactical reasoning behind it. Well, the point of the Y-Wing was that it was a hybrid bomber starfighter. It was faster than most bombers, but its payload was weaker. And you even pointed out that bombers would have more power than Y-Wings would. Hey, remember your nuke argument? How you said that hyperspace weaponry would outmode anything else because of firepower? Yeah, bombers are higher firepower weaponry that requires protection in order to function tactically. Huh. You know, it's almost like you're full of shit. Air-to-ground bombing with planes that trade speed and or air-to-air munitions for the ability to nuke shit already exists in the real world, and it was deemed a better tactic in overall military strategy to use a protected bomber with more firepower than have a lower firepower semi-bomber. Oh, but then let me talk about your easy-to-destroy and friendly fire argument. Bro, we see this thing take fighter class weaponry. Saying they get hull breached by slight debris is a stretch at best, but I know what you're referring to with all this. The point where one blows up a piece of debris and collides with two on either side. I mean, that was a TIE fighter wing, hardly what I'd call the slightest of debris in the first place. Then two larger pieces of debris collide with the two next to it, one on each side. You ever think that this also happened as people were opening the bombing bay, and the one that survived actually waited until near the last minute to open the bay doors, and even then only took structural damage when the doors opened? There was one that went down early to focus fire, but we'll notice how that one didn't explode all over the place. It's almost like not keeping the enemy engaged away from the bombers is dangerous or something, which brings me to my next point. Part of the reason this potential accident can happen is because of the tight formation that bombers use, and there's a good reason for them to do that from a tactical perspective, as it actually helps mitigate being able to focus down a singular target. It's still possible, but that's why it's the job of the fighters to prevent that. It's also the reason that Poe's initial job was to take out surface cannons on the frigate. You take out the ground-to-air weaponry first, and then go on the bombing run when the ship has to rely on fighter support, making it essentially a dogfight centered around the bombers, which is much more to your advantage. Yeah, how do you know that the Y-Wings were bombers? Never pointed out in any movies, so how exactly are you aware of this information? Could it be supplementary material? So, in other words, if not for supplementary material, you would have no reason to question the lack of use of Y-Wings because they're stated in these movies as old tech and look more like starfighters than bombers. What was that earlier about relying on supplemental materials for important plot points? If it applies to making them make sense, it also applies to making them not make sense. Oh, final point. The fact that this specific use of bombers was nigh suicidal, yeah, that's kind of the point. This is supposed to be a bad move on Poe's part that just managed to work because Poe's this trilogy's Han. Kind of a minor thing, but... well, it's the sex with your mother thing again. I don't really need to disqualify when you've already got a host of things that disqualify what you're saying on a fundamental level in the first place. Now, do I?
Oh, and also because they completely forgot how gravity works. I just love how there are people making excuses for this abortion of a movie by saying, oh, the bombs are just magnetized. Really? Then how do they not get pulled straight into the side of the bomber ship when released?
They're actually pulled into the side of the ship before released. Electromagnets are what keep them in place. You reverse the polarity of the electromagnet in order to propel the bombs away from the ship. The lack of gravity outside the ship means that the bombs are already heading in the direction, so they will continue to move in that direction. I can't really explain the scientific specifics of the magnetic attraction to the target other than two ways. For one, I'd imagine it works like an electromagnetic version of a heat-seeking missile, which would be more effective if delivered at such close range. And 2, Star Wars is soft sci-fi, you fucking idiot!
These things are ineffective in every logical capacity. Why is the Resistance wasting resources on them? Because Rian Johnson wanted to reference World War II? And for someone who wanted to reference World War II, he seems to have a pretty awful idea for how the military actually functions. I mean, we already went over the stupidity of Holdo not cooperating with Poe and not debriefing anyone about her plan, while also being the worst leader ever, but then you have shit like Rose heroically stopping Finn from sacrificing himself. She would have doomed the entire galaxy had Luke not shown up. In real life, she would have been labeled a traitor and sent to the brig.
Yeah, no, she wouldn't have. Finn was already in violation of a direct order from his superior. For someone who wants to get onto Rian Johnson for not knowing how the military works, you sure as shit don't know how the military works.
There's also the bullshit with Hux not immediately destroying the Resistance because he wants to toy with them before their ultimate annihilation. That does not make sense. I can understand this coming from someone like the Joker, but not a military leader whose priority is to destroy the enemy as soon as possible. They wouldn't simply toy with their enemy, giving them time to come up with a plan for escape. If this was supposed to show his arrogance and stupid pride, it doesn't work because it actively retcons his character from The Force Awakens. In that film, Hux was a legitimately terrifying general. There was a strong veracity to his presence on screen. He was a villain that you could take seriously because his demeanor was that menacing. In this movie, he's treated like a joke. He's the butt of everyone else's antics, he's portrayed as incompetent, and his demeanor from the previous movie isn't present, and he doesn't really do anything except yell and point. It's like Rian Johnson didn't know what to do with him, so he just used him as a framework for the film's terrible comedy. And when we get to the Rise of Skywalker,
I'm the spy.
You know what? I don't think either of these idiots knew what to do with Hux.
Okay, so first of all, yep. Internal consistency. That's what this section should still be called. Fuck me running. But sure, let's talk about the argument of Hux's arrogance and toying with them being why he didn't finish off the Resistance when he had the chance. I mean, I don't really buy that, but arrogance is part of the reason that certain tactics worked, especially notable in the case of the Holdo maneuver. He actually did continue to rain down fire on the Resistance the whole time, and you can paint him not doing the decloaking scan without being prodded to as incompetence all you want, but him holding back out of cockiness? I don't really agree with that. Oh, but then we get to the point where your attempt to shit on the trilogy as a whole bites you in the ass because it tells a story arc with Hux. Force Awakens is the height of his threat. One could call this the exposition of who he is at the beginning of the story. The first movie even ends with what could be considered an inciting incident, namely the thing that sets in motion the rising action we'll see in The Last Jedi. His failure to take out the Resistance triggers a downward slide in perceived rank that he spends most of the movie trying to rectify in order to earn his place ahead of his rival Kylo Ren, which leads to Kylo Ren taking control, the climax where he's lost, so begins falling action in Rise of Skywalker that leads to his decision to betray the First Order, and the falling action in the end of the film being caught and still having hope that Kylo Ren will lose. They actually did know what they were doing, and this movie tells an important part of Hux's story, the beginning of his decline.
But the lack of military understanding goes beyond just character portrayals and interactions. It also relates to the terrible tactics of the military powers. If you want a thorough breakdown of this, I recommend checking out these videos. They go into far more detail on the subject than I can possibly hope to. To put it simply, the way the military is portrayed here is really childish and absent-minded.
I mean, fair, but that's kind of true in a lot of Star Wars media. I also like how your explanation is, other people explain it, go watch them. There are some tactical blunders in the movie, but I mean, fuck, if you're not going to talk about them yourself, I can't exactly talk about how good or bad your point in this video is, can I? Amazing how you can make a video this long, feel the need to keep some points short, and still wind up with a repetitive filler though. Very impressed.
It's actually about as childish as the way the sequel trilogy portrays the Force. They took away all the deep philosophy behind it and just turned it into a superpower. The way the Force was described in the OT made it into something much more important than that. Even the prequels, in spite of their problems, took the time to show the intrinsic and delicate nature of the Force. So much careful thinking and wisdom went into establishing it, and it's been further expanded in things like the KOTOR games and the animated television shows. The sequel trilogy takes all of that, crumbles it into a ball, and throws it out the window in favor of portraying it as a generic Dragon Ball power scaling system, with random special abilities they just pull out of their ass.
I mean, I kind of agree with you on some of it, especially the whole space phone thing. But look, I want to address the screenshot in particular. I don't care if you talk about it when you're making this point. This is actually consistent, because one of the most consistently used force powers is essentially telekinesis. It's something all the movies and all the expanded material, most of which isn't canon BT dubs, uses, right down to making objects fly into your hand. In fact, the training method of pulling the X-Wing out of the swamp in the OT is used to identify power scaling in the Force. So if any force power has a right to be called a power scaling mechanic, it's the moves rocks around thing.
And The Last Jedi has more than a few infamous examples. Probably the most infamous and laughed at example is how it apparently gives you immunity to the vacuum of space. Yep, the classic for all the wrong reasons Leia Poppin scene. When was it even established that Leia was this powerful with the Force? I'm not saying that she can't use it, but she never used it for anything drastic. She was never shown to use it for combat or dire situations. If she was supposed to have gotten stronger in the last 30 years, you think they would have expanded on that a little more. At least in a way that makes sense. But no, this is how we're introduced to Leia's ability to use the Force. Flying back to the ship like she's goddamn Superman, completely immune to the elements of space, and somehow, quite fucking miraculously, suffering no long-term damage from this predicament. I'm sorry, but the Force does not work as a barrier to the vacuum of space.
I did not expect to be talking about this here. And I'm sorry, is that what this is supposed to be? I didn't really pick up on that. And yeah, I agree. That's kind of dumb bullshit, especially since Leia wasn't displayed as Force sensitive in the movies before now. Even though, you know, come on, she is a Skywalker. But yeah, this is an example of one of the ones I personally agree with you on, and is probably one of the most frustrating parts of the movie for me. You could have just had her get injured. You didn't need all this.
Not even the most powerful Force user would survive the vacuum unprotected. Temperature and a lack of oxygen is one thing, but the absence of pressure would absolutely kill you. Your blood would boil and you would be dead in seconds.
We do not have the hard science on that. While theoretically that sounds correct, there's a couple of factors. For one, she wasn't out there for more than seconds. Even realistically, you would survive in the vacuum of space for about 15 seconds. And this doesn't even consider the fact that the inside of a ship has artificial atmosphere, so being near where that dissipated would theoretically provide a small semblance of life support to see you last longer than normal. As for pulling yourself back with the Force, it's probably a lot easier than doing so when you don't have gravity to worry about, actually. So someone weaker in the Force would probably be more likely to do it than if they needed to wrest control of a lightsaber from a distance away. Of course, all this is theoretical, and even without the fictional elements at play, you'd still have 15 seconds of consciousness and potentially up to 2 minutes alive in the vacuum of space anyway, since your theoretical understanding is stuck in the 3rd fucking grade in 1994.
You can't just dismiss it by saying it's science fiction, so it's obviously not a realistic portrayal of scientific stuff. There's a limit to how far you can stretch that. All science fiction is based on real-life science in some way. It helps establish the rules of your science fiction world. Pulling off shit like this goes against the concept of having rules.
Okay, as much as I think you deserve death for making me defend my least favorite part of this movie, it did let me point out how this is bullshit. I explained scientifically how you don't just die the instant you enter the vacuum of space, especially since your body heat wouldn't drop as fast, dingus, almost forgot about that, but also how short-term survival in space is already not far outside the realm of scientific accuracy, so your point's already wrong. But sure, let's hold the franchise with space wizards to the same requisite scientific accuracy of Star Trek, and continue forgetting that science fiction comes in variable levels of scientific accuracy. Absolute fucking bitch nugget.
And it also results in other types of bullshit. How the hell did they open the door to let Leia back in without decompressing the rest of the ship? How did the group get her back in without getting sucked into space?
Artificial atmosphere. It's the same fucking way every frigate hangar works. Bitch nugget.
Then you have Luke somehow projecting himself across millions of light years in his confrontation with Kylo. Are you really that dense? If Luke was supposed to be this powerful the whole time, why in the almighty hell did he not help fight the First Order? Instead of using his X-Wing to fly over there, he just stays on the island like an idiot. The purpose of this scene was for Luke to sacrifice himself to buy time for the others to escape. But this is the most ridiculous way they could have done it. Maybe this might not have been so bad if it was something just by itself, but when you you combine it with the Leia Poppins scene and all the other stupid stuff they do with the Force in this movie, it comes across as an extreme interpretation. When he asks Rey if we were expecting him to take his lightsaber and go against the entire First Order, this is proof that he could have done that.
Hey, Yoda was incredibly powerful in the Force in the original trilogy, and you know what he couldn't do because of his age? Fight. Like, are you shitting me right now? Astral projection just takes an image of you to another place. Obi-Wan was also powerful in the Force, and he was shit-kicked in a lightsaber duel as well. Considering Luke killed himself in order to astral project that far, stands to reason that if he showed up himself, he would have just gotten turned into paste when Kylo fired on him like he actually did to his astral self in the movie. If Luke wanted to stand a chance against Kylo, honestly, I think he should have just picked up Tasha's Otherworldly Guys or something instead. Would have worked much better.
It's not like he got weaker in his old age. At least we could have gotten a proper lightsaber duel.
You do realize all that dodging was done by a mental projection of Luke, right? Like, he did get weaker in old age, but physically so instead of in the Force. That's why Yoda flipping around and shit in the prequel trilogy makes so much more sense than him trying to break out moves like that in the OT. His physical capabilities are different. Oh, and this all ignores the philosophical reasons and psychological handicaps that Luke would have fighting a student he felt he had failed, that they spend the whole fucking movie explaining, you chuckle fuck.
And that's not even including the bullshit interacting with the living world after you die. Why is Yoda able to summon lightning as a Force ghost? If Force users can interact with the physical world after they die, why didn't the Jedi of the past do anything against the First Order? Why didn't they help Luke and Leia stop them? Can the Sith do it too? Can they interact with the living like the Jedi can? Why aren't they helping Kylo and Snoke conquering the galaxy? Why aren't we seeing Sith and Jedi ghosts fighting each other?
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to answer the question about the Sith being able to do it. No. The Sith don't get Force ghosts. That's a light side thing. And the fact that this is the case is exactly why Force ghosts don't do shit. We also know from Star Wars canon that being able to become a full Force ghost requires special training, which is actually part of the reason Qui-Gon Jinn isn't one. I mean, there's the Anakin exception, but it's the Anakin exception. The only Force spirits shown to interact with the physical world have also been Yoda and Luke. So since it seems logical that most Jedi don't become Force spirits, it can also be logically inferred that not all Force spirits are capable of interacting with the physical world the way that Yoda and Luke do. And that's just me using what we see in the movies as an indicator of why, by the way. No supplemental material needed other than a brain, so I can see why you had so much trouble with this one. And even if we assume that the only reason that the Force ghosts don't participate in this conflict is based on the philosophy of the Force, didn't you earlier jump on this movie's dick about undermining the philosophical underpinnings of the Force? So, you want to actually undermine them instead of having applications the CG will allow for. Got it.
You see, this is why you can't just make shit up as you go along. You have to carefully consider how this stuff fits into the story, or else you end up with questions like this. Now you have too much contrivance and it ruins the cohesion. It destroys the internal consistency of Star Wars.
I mean, you can keep telling yourself it does if it helps you sleep at night, but that actually doesn't make it the truth. Fun fact. And more importantly, it ain't that deep. When you look hard enough to find something to have a problem with, you're going to find a lot of things because you're not also looking at the other side. You know, kind of like it's how it's so easy for people to make commentaries. It's easy to find flaws. It's easy to debunk those flaws by digging deeper. It's harder to agree with a video while you still have problems with it, though.
I brought this up in my original review, and it bears repeating. When you're making a story of any kind, whether it's Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, the MCU, or even My Little Pony, internal consistency is extremely important. You introduce rules to how your world works, and you have to follow those rules.
True, but another part of the world building and storytelling lies in your ability to bend those rules in ways that make sense with the internal consistency of the story. In fact, there's one overarching rule in all of media that applies. The rule of cool. Sometimes you just bend the rules to suit the plot and figure out why it happened later. This is even a concept in the rulebook for D&D. If the rules interfere with the story, then fuck the rules. But again, implying The Last Jedi actually did.
Nothing in The Last Jedi, let alone the rest of the sequel trilogy, properly fits with anything that happened in the original 6 movies. Hyperspace ramming, the bombers, the backwards development of military tactics, Force ghosts interacting with the physical world, the ass-pulled Force powers, portraying the Force as a power race, the First Order rising out of nowhere, the portrayal of several characters, and that's just the worst of it.
Okay, so not only have I explained the reasons a lot of this isn't as inconsistent as you think it is, I can apply one major reasoning to almost everything that you just brought up. Timeline. Time still moves forward in fiction, and notably, there's a lot of moving forward that happened between the OT and the sequel trilogy. Like, a lot. Like, more than the gap between the prequels and the OT by 11 years. 11 years is a lot of extra time to include, so it's no wonder there's changed tech and a difference in understanding and culture, numbnuts. We know a lot of shit now that we didn't know 11 years ago. I cannot express enough how much 19 years and 30 years is a significant difference in gaps of time, especially since early bombers were used in Return of the Jedi, you dumbass!
The things done in the sequel trilogy, let alone The Last Jedi, make the meaning behind the world building and mythology weaker and less compelling. Things that were established in the OT and the prequels no longer hold any weight. And it also makes the OT pointless since Luke, Han, and Leia went through all that crap to defeat the Empire just for them to come back. You can't even make the argument that the First Order is a completely different threat because according to The Rise of Skywalker, it was all part of Palpatine's plan and he was alive the whole time. It's objectively bad storytelling.
Not really. The original trilogy told a complete story. The sequel trilogy tells another complete story. And don't fucking put the Palpatine shit on The Last Jedi, because that was not in The Last Jedi. That is a specifically Rise of Skywalker problem. There's no indication of Palpatine being relevant to the sequel trilogy at any point until the third movie. That's not a reason this movie is the worst Star Wars movie. Unless, of course, you just wanted a reason to bitch. Wait, what am I saying? You? Needing a reason to bitch about something unrelated? Completely unrealistic. Oh, and, internally inconsistent.
And for anyone who tries to say something like, well, if you view the sequel trilogy as a standalone trilogy or any of the 3 movies on their own, maybe they get better. No, they don't. Even without the continuity and world building of the original 6 movies, these 3 are still lackluster.
That's highly subjective and fueled by the bias of your own opinion on the franchise as a whole. Would you still think this if these weren't Star Wars movies? You can say yes now, but, well, if we're being realistically honest about things, you don't know that, especially since a lot of your arguments, especially in the section you say this, mind you, are based on the lore outside of this movie and even the other movies. So that argument isn't even relevant to what you're talking about. See, I debunked your straw man better than you. Now shut the fuck. I know you're not going to shut up. I just need to end the interjection with a one-liner, okay? It's kind of what I do.
And aside from that, it's a self-defeating way to view the sequel trilogy. You can't just say view these movies as their own thing because they're not supposed to be seen as their own thing. It's called the sequel trilogy for a reason. The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker. All of them are supposed to be smaller parts of a greater whole.
Okay, cool. So you said the thing that debunks the straw man. Okay. It's a shame that this is only partially correct. The thing is that both of these concepts are correct. The movies should be able to be consistent as a whole and also tell stories that can be understood independently. Like, that's why it's important we include Skywalkers and Palpatines and whatnot in this stage of the story. It's supposed to be a continuation and a conclusion of that. But at the same time, the movies weren't all released as one unit either. Being able to get the full arc within each movie that builds on the arc of the overall story is how that works. The reason trilogies work narratively is because it operates on a 3-part structure, and the way Star Wars is put forth tends to have each trilogy act as part of a bigger trilogy. That's why each of the trilogies is able to follow different main characters, which brings me to point out why almost everything you've said about internal consistency is bullshit on another widespread level. See, when you're telling a multi-part story, each part should escalate from the previous part so that things further in the story feel more important. This isn't a 100% rule. You can tell overarching plots without constantly escalating and even get away with dialing back in some moments, but generally, you're going to be moving upward and forward rather than staying in the same place. So, new tactics, new abilities, and power scaling that the previous stage of a story didn't have, yeah, that's a logical storyline progression. Saying, why didn't they just use this more powerful shit before, isn't really internal consistency. And in reality, the question in regards to internal inconsistency becomes why it's not being done later, which for the most part, A lot of this stuff was used and considered after it was introduced the first time, so your internal consistency argument, based on how internal consistency actually fucking works, falls flat on its face. Let me put it in terms of D&D so you really understand this. Let's say I write a big bad who is under the party's skin, and in one session he casts Fireball. Do we need to ask the question of why didn't he use Fireball in the party sooner? No, we don't. The big bad can also grow as the party does. It's possible he didn't have the spell. I can write in dialogue that has him talk about a new trick he has for them, but I don't necessarily need to because that can be implied. So later he has a chance to cast Fireball and doesn't. Do we ask the question then? Yeah, but the answer might very well be Meteor Swarm is a better spell. Do you get how your questions of internal inconsistency because of a one-off plot implement don't track yet?
Star Wars isn't just some franchise. It's the biggest and most important franchise in all of media. Its massive scope is still being discussed across the board because it is the staple of Western media.
So, if there's like so many ways to debunk this, I could honestly go 10 hours doing it without repeating myself, and I'm not sure that's an exaggeration, but I'll stick with one, not 1 hour, 1 point. I can agree with you about Star Wars being a staple of Western media, but to call it the staple would discount tons of non-fantasy and non-action franchises that have not only had longer runtime than Star Wars, but also are more universally known. The fact that the company that created one of these was big enough to buy Star Wars should tell you right there that calling it the staple is asinine. And that's without taking shit like James Bond into consideration. And to make things clear, this isn't me trying to downplay Star Wars or say it's not important, because it is. But I'm saying your comment is a massive stretch. Then again, something you said being a stretch, I think I just summed up the whole video in one sentence. Why am I still here?
It invented every trick in the book in terms of world building, lore, big-scale storytelling, character deconstruction.
This just in, Shakespeare doesn't exist. Or Star Trek. Or, I mean, really? I don't really think you want the list, buddy.
There are millions of parodies and spoofs of it specifically because of how great an influence it had in the 70s and 80s alone.
There's also millions of parodies of Star Trek. There's also millions of retellings of Romeo and Juliet. There's also millions of parodies of tons of things. This isn't an argument. But it does raise a problem with a point you made earlier. Remember how you said that Star Wars was supposed to be a serious space opera and how I pointed out that there's an intrinsically silly aspect to the entire franchise? That's the reason there are so many parodies, my guy. The fact that there are so many parodies is probably why the modern creators doing Star Wars are more comfortable embracing that intrinsic silliness, or at the very least, feel the audience will resonate with it. It's almost like you're using the length of this garbage fire to mask the fact that you're contradicting yourself.
It revolutionized so many storytelling tools and techniques we still use today. It's the golden example for why the "it's just a movie," or "it's just a video game," or "it's just a cartoon," or "it's a work of fiction that isn't real so it's not worth getting upset and angry over" excuse is a terrible dismissal of criticism. It changed the very foundation of filmmaking and inspired millions of people worldwide. No other franchise in the history of media can ever hope to wield even a candle to it.
Alright, cool. So now I get to talk about the top grossing movies of all time for no reason. When you factor in for inflation, Star Wars is number 4 and The Force Awakens is number 10. So, you know, what film franchise is holding a candle to that? Avengers, with Endgame landing in number 5. And it would not shock me if an Avengers movie wound up overtaking that number 10 one day. Although the world may have fundamentally changed now to where that list is mostly set in stone as well, if I'm being perfectly honest about it. But let's move on. We can see the image of Avengers holding a candle to Star Wars in the box office on a year-by-year basis as well. Star Wars has a lot of movies that top the box office, but so does Avengers. When they were both available, they just about alternated the top spot. That should tell you right there that the MCU is holding a candle. Oh, and you want to talk influences on the tropes of filmmaking? The MCU changed how film franchises are considered, dumbass! The cinematic universe model is now the go-to method that everybody wants to replicate, including fucking Star Wars, in case you forgot about Rogue One and Solo. Fuck me, is every part of your argument a giant turd, even when you're just heaping generic praise on a George Lucas's Gungan cock?
It was ahead of its time in so many ways, and the sequel trilogy completely disregards that entirely, in favor of empowering women, intersectional politics, and horribly thought out plot twists that amount to nothing but lazy shock value.
Feminism! You know, because women aren't allowed to be protagonists! You know what? Nah, you got a whole section on Kathleen Kennedy. I'm gonna save the actual nuanced argument for this for then. Same with the intersectional politics thing, because it's the same concept of basically saying something is political because they cast someone that isn't white for a role. No. Let's talk about that plot twist thing, specifically with killing Snoke. Without Rise of Skywalker's dumb Palpatine twist that I could honestly make a whole video about being bad myself, let's talk about Kylo killing Snoke. Yeah, remember in the OT when Palpatine tried to get Luke to kill him so that he would turn to the dark side because hate is what fuels the dark side? That information, spelled out elsewhere in the franchise, is implied to be Kylo's reasoning here. He wants the throne, he kills Snoke to take the throne, it pushes him further to the dark side instead of bringing him to the light. And you're using this as an example of them throwing out what makes Star Wars? Were you dropped on your head as a child, or was your frontal lobe always damaged?
It's completely disrespectful to such an important legacy. And that's not even including the plot holes. Just so many plot holes. The Last Jedi alone is a treasure trove of things that just don't make sense. As a standalone film, and especially when you put it next to the other movies. Why did Phasma cooperate with Han and Finn to lower the Starkiller shields if her armor was blaster-proof?
Because a blaster would do more point-blank range than in a longer distance.
Where is the galaxy-wide rage at the First Order destroying 5 planets? Do they not give a shit that they committed mass murder?
Literally the US not participating in World War II until they themselves were attacked, and even then not being involved in the German front until much later than that. Also, fun fact, the entirety of the script was written before the Ukraine situation, and with how many right-wing politicians say that the US should not be involved in Ukraine. Big ol' oof there, buddy.
Why didn't the Order immediately target Leia's cruise ship to prevent the Resistance from escaping?
Because they were being fired on by something else. I'm waiting for the plot hole that isn't easily explained here. Is it coming?
Why did Kylo just assume that he killed Luke instead of making sure he was dead?
Because he was a fucking child! Like, really?
Why did Finn and Rose not take the slave children with them, and not drop them off at a safe location before returning to the ship? You realize that by destroying the casino, you're subjecting them to more hard labor and torture, right?
Finally! Finally! I can't explain this one too, but at least it's not as simple as a single fucking sentence. Getting caught trying to escape could have been far worse for them than it even would have been for Finn and Rose, for one. It's also very possible that they like tending to the animals and are only unhappy because of the mistreatment they got and not because of the work itself. Based on the scene at the end of the movie, they're fine. It's not well explained if you dig into that, but it's clear their situation is not as bad at one moment as you made it out to be. It doesn't mean it's outright good, but it can be explained with the same question of why people stay in toxic work environments. Psychological reasons that are more complicated, especially when you don't have a lot of options to work with.
If Holdo had a gun the whole time, why did she allow Poe to continue his mutiny?
Oh, for fuck's sake. Now we're back to the one-sentence explanations. Because she was outnumbered. She had like 3 or 4 guns pointed at her. How on Kashyyyk do you expect to win that firefight when you don't have the element of surprise at all?
Why didn't they take the gun away from her if she's more than likely to use it against you?
Because it was concealed. Frisking her would have given her the same opportunity she took here. It was better at the end of the situation to keep sights on her and shoot her if she moved, which is the actual question that hopefully is what you're about to say next.
Why is Finn suddenly able to pilot a ship when it was a main plot point in the previous film that he needed a pilot because he was inexperienced in flying a ship by himself?
Okay, not the one I was looking for, but that is kind of a good point. That being said, Finn has also been cited as a quick study, and with a pilot not available, Finn has to learn on the fly. Also, maybe a Y-Wing is easier to pilot than the Millennium Falcon, which is an old hunk of junk in the original movies, by the way.
When the First Order has the Resistance trapped on Crate, why didn't they call another one of those dreadnoughts to fire on them? It's not like they were in short supply.
Time. The escape pods would get away fast. By the time the dreadnought got there, it would be too late. Or at least that can be inferred. Like, hyperspace travel still takes time. That's why the First Order's vessels showed up after the jump.
With all the talk about tracking them through light speed, why didn't they track the Millennium Falcon at the end of the film?
The explanation of Poe's plan gives exactly why the Millennium Falcon is able to get out. The original plan involved essentially tripping a breaker, whereas what's done here is that the main destroyer systems go down completely. The 6-minute window they would have originally had to escape would, logically, be extended, if not indefinitely, since it was stated to be the experimental tech, meaning repair or replacement of it may be impossible in the immediate situation. When you apply a more permanent answer to a problem, you get a more permanent solution. This is just me using my brain to actively explain to you things that should intuitively make sense without a detailed explanation. Fuck.
Why they let the Terminator win the election?